The Devil in the Details by Danielle Ackley-McPhail. The naked limbs of the gnarled tree reached high above Camden Fen, as if to snatch the stars from the sky. The night was harsh, the air dry with the extreme cold. All around, snow glittered on the ground, everywhere except beneath the tree. Camden shuddered and edged back. He was new here in Basking Ridge, the odd kid out, the weirdo. Somehow all the others at school knew he'd been sent to live with his grandmother Camilla because Mama wasn't right in the head. Or that's what they said anyway, before they dared him to touch the cursed tree with a history of hangings, both lawful and otherwise. Around him, the light breeze grew more forceful, until it rattled the branches overhead, making them moan and sigh and wail. Camden shivered again and jerked back further. The sound echoed his last memory of Mama, both screaming gibberish and sobbing as if her best friend had died, all while being strapped into a strange white coat. Reaching not for him, but for her favorite oak tree, the one she kept getting caught climbing naked until the day the ambulance had come to take her away. Camden couldn't really blame anyone for calling his little family weird. Heck, he'd be the first one to admit it. After all, he'd been a part of it for 13 years. For nearly half an hour he stood there, in the bitter cold, trying to get up the nerve to move closer and touch the bowl. He just couldn't do it. Something deep inside him fought the very concept. As if before him lay true madness, and to press his skin against it courted such within himself. He was, however, both fascinated and horrified by the chain-link fence wrapped so close around the tree that the bark had begun to swallow it. Beneath the links he could see great gaping scars from where the superstitious had tried to bring the old tree down. In the distance, a revving engine broke the spell on him. Camden jumped and spun around, his eyes scanning the road. The other kids had taunted him, telling him a speeding black car would get him if he drew near the tree. He bet one of them had talked an older sibling into coming out and pranking him if he proved braver than they thought he'd be. Squaring his shoulders, he turned back to the oak, and before he could talk himself out of it, he lurched forward, slapping his left palm against the bark. Seconds later he yanked it away, overwhelmed by a desperate sense of grasping, of some essence, somehow oddly familiar, clinging to his. He landed on his ass as he stumbled back, vigorously rubbing his palm down the rough cords of his pants. The skin itched and burned, as if little runnels of acid etched its surface. Peering at his hand, he very nearly screamed. For a brief instant in the starlight, it seemed the pattern of the bark had clung there, shaping the skin. Again, the revving of an engine, followed by the squeal of tires on asphalt. Camden scrambled to his feet, with teeth chattering and the muscles across his shoulders knotted. He hurried in a limping jog across the field, away from the road. Compulsively, he kept looking behind him, almost missing the blaze of the car's headlights as he noticed the brisk wind dancing in his wake, brushing away his footprints. Maybe Mama wasn't the only one going mad, he thought, as he scrambled even faster to reach the trees at the edge of the meadow as the car pursued him. Camden was back. He couldn't help it. The tree drew him, called to him. A forsaken soul alone in the meadow. He could identify with it. There was little to nothing left of the snow, except for some dirty, knobby piles sheltered from the sun. Weeks had gone by since he had touched the tree. He told the others, but they called him a liar. His hands still tingled, but otherwise looked normal, leaving him nothing to show for his daring. His classmates, led by Antony, the school bully, kept egging him on, demanding he bring them some kind of proof, being too chicken to follow him out there to see for themselves. He couldn't imagine what kind of proof he could bring that they wouldn't just call another lie. He'd never had a cell phone, a situation his grandmother hadn't bothered to rectify. It hardly mattered, though. He'd yet to psych himself up enough to even cross beneath the tree's branches. He caught himself rubbing his palm against his leg, something he'd been doing since that first faithful night. The skin still looked like normal skin, a little rougher and more calloused. Only every so often it seemed to shimmer a gray-green shade, like the mossy bark of an oak tree. He had to be imagining it. He'd looked up the legends surrounding the tree, and all they mentioned was some crackpot notion that if you touched the tree, your hand would turn black if you ate at a diner. Who came up with this crazy-ass shit? With a final look at his hand, Camden turned and headed home. Weeks went by. The barest hint of spring had begun to chase away winter's chill. Every time Camden turned around, he would swear there was a black car somewhere nearby, windows tinted illegally dark, but then he would look again and it would be gone. He told himself not to be stupid and did his best to forget about the tree and all the legends he'd read about it, as his classmates seemed to have done. They taunted and bullied, but apparently lost interest in the challenge they'd issued. Left to himself, shunned even by the outcast, Camden spent a lot of time knocking around his grandmother's place, hanging out in the vast yard, never quite feeling welcome there any more than he did at school. He began to notice something quite peculiar while striving to stay out of her way. There was no wood, no trees in the yard, no white picket fence. In fact, hers was wrought iron, beautifully ornate, but cold and hard. Even the house, he learned, was poured concrete, and the garage at the back of the property was a stark cinder-block building with large metal doors locked tight. He had tried to peer in the dusty windows, but his grandmother came across him poking around. Her gaze, when he caught her eye, was stony as she sharply pointed him away. Though she generally seemed to ignore him as much as possible, while providing his care within the letter of the law, from that point forward he felt constantly watched. When he went to sleep that night, he dreamt to the sound of tree branches wailing, dreams that did not bear remembering. "That's private property you keep skulking around," Grandmother snapped at him one morning, just around the spring equinox. She stood in front of the kitchen sink watching dishes, as stiff as one of her wrought iron fence rails. "Stay away from that infernal tree. You keep away from that meadow, or I'll let the sheriff deal with you." Camden nodded but said nothing. He flinched as she whirled on him, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "Do you hear me, young man?" "Yes, Grandmother," he stuttered, shocked by the strength she wielded, despite her seeming age. This was the first time she had ever touched him. His grandmother humphed and turned away, her expression hard and etched with bitterness. Until they had come for his mother, Camden hadn't even known he had a grandmother. Though she did her duty and took him in, she clearly did not seem at all pleased about it. She was his father's mother, according to the social worker. His father. There was something else Camden had never had. At least not in any practical sense. His father had passed away early on, before Camden had been old enough to remember him. Even so, by the stories Mama had shared, and the love she clearly felt, Camden found it hard to believe his father had come from this harsh, unfeeling woman. He wondered exactly how many days until he turned 18, and had no one to answer to but the law. Lowering his head, he pretended interest in his cold breakfast until Grandmother threw down her rag and left the room. That was when he caught himself again, rubbing his palm against his leg. He brought his other hand up and ran his fingertips along where the tingling had begun to burn. His palm was rough and thick, but he could feel his veins prominently, branching like roots beneath the skin. Shuddering, he drew his fingers away, cold chills coursing through him. Camden dreamt of his mother, her willowy form, her delicate features, the sense of wildness about her, and the slight edge of madness in her gaze that he had for so long denied the existence of, eased, if not banished, only when she draped herself among the tree branches, bare skin against bark, not quite one with the tree, but longing to be. But most of all, he dreamt of her desperate grasping for the branches as she was pulled from it that very last time, of the panic in her gaze as the strange men restrained her, of the hopelessness that dimmed her gaze while Camden watched the vehicle containing her drive further away. He woke, gasping, and all he could think of was that damned chain-link fence wrapped around the gnarled oak, so reminiscent of the restraints binding his mother. Camden could do nothing for her, but the tree, that was different. Though every impulse screamed at him no, a wild, crazed idea took root. Quietly, he climbed from bed and drew on his clothes, not bothering with socks or shoes. With gentle steps, he crept to the window and slowly slid the sash open. A firm push popped the screen from the window. Camden grabbed it before it could clatter to the pavers below and leaned it against his bedroom wall before climbing out and sliding the window shut behind him. In the moonlight, his shoulders itched more than his palm ever did. Ignoring the sensation of being watched, he made his way across town until he came to Antony's house. He knew which bedroom belonged to the bully, because he often tossed things at Camden as he walked by. Not bothering to be quiet, Camden rapped on the glass. He heard a thud, then watched as the window opened, revealing Antony's scowling face. "You are so dead, dickwad." Camden ignored him. "Give me a bolt cutter and I'll give you the evidence that I touched the tree." Antony smirked. "Yeah, right. Give it to me, or I'll tell everyone you were too much of a pussy to touch the tree yourself." The expression on the bully's face grew even uglier, at odds with his tousled hair and pajamas. When he came through the open window, Camden braced himself for violence, but the other boy just crept around to the garage and disappeared inside, coming out a moment later with the bolt cutters. "Have proof tomorrow or I'm kicking your ass. And either way, I'm telling my dad you're stealing these." Antony's father was the sheriff. Camden just took the tool and turned away, hurrying off into the night in the direction of the meadow and the tree. The moon sat heavy and full in the sky, bathing the meadow in a pale blue glow, seemingly everywhere except in the area surrounded by the tree. He couldn't help but think of the name he discovered when researching the legends. The Devil's Tree. He shivered. Though the air of madness surrounding the oak scared the piss out of him, instinct told him the essence of the tree was not evil. Steeling himself, he approached the bowl, gaze locked on the angry scars left by frightened mortals, the metal links yet binding and cutting the tree. Dropping to his knees, he wedged the snipping end of the bolt cutters against the first link, cringing as the steel cut more into the bark than the fence. A sharp pain shot through his left hand, but he continued to leverage his weight on the handles of the tool, half murmuring apologies, though he scarcely knew why, or to whom. With a sharp snap, the first link gave away. He sensed a satisfaction not altogether his own. The meadow seemed poised in anticipation, a hush descending to blanket out the hum of usual night sounds. As he started on the second link, the gunning of a distant engine reached his ears. Straining until pain screamed through his hand, Camden struggled even harder to cut through the links. He was barely 3/4 of the way through when bright lights pinned him to the tree. With all his weight, he got through all but the last bit of fence before he heard the squeal of brakes behind him, and felt the sting of rocks thrown up from the still hard ground. "Get away from that tree, you devil spawn!" Venom dripped from the words. Again, Camden was reminded of his grandmother's unexpected strength as she shoved him away from the final link before he had cut all the way through. He managed to keep his grip on the bolt cutters, but lost his balance. "You will not release her now. You will not set her free to corrupt more good men like my Tommy." Some small part of him noticed the roar of a second car approaching, but most of his focus stayed riveted as he realized the devil his grandmother spoke of was his mother. She wasn't making sense, but even more than ever, Camden was driven to strip the iron fence from the tree. He eyed the final link, which held together with the barest sliver, so slight he dared wonder if he would even need the bolt cutters to break it free. His grandmother stood over him, her eyes ablaze and no small measure of madness dancing around the edges of her expression. Camden was certain he spied loathing for him in her gaze. Her chest heaved and outrage etched harder lines into her face than those already there. "Why did you even take me in?" Camden asked. "That she-devil stole my only son. You are half his, and by God, I will see the demon half run out of you." She moved forward as if to strike him. Camden set his left hand behind him, bracing for the blow. He gasped as his flesh came down on a gnarled root. Heat blazed through him from the point of contact until he seemed to swell with it. Weariness draining from his limbs, the strength filled him as it never had before. In the moonlight, his skin seemed subtly ridged, like an echo of the oak's bark before him, a state that struck him as both strange and fitting, if a puzzle for later. For now, there were other things to deal with. He did not raise a hand to his grandmother, but he did climb to his feet, flexing his toes in the dirt and grass as he tightened his grip on the bolt cutters. Tension crackled on the air as she took a step closer, brandishing a crowbar she must have carried from the large black Cadillac still running behind her. As she moved, a second car drew up beside the first, strobe lights sending wild pulses of color across the meadow. The door clicked open, and the sheriff's voice called out, "Camilla, you will stop right there." For a moment, she looked like she would resist, but slowly the tip of the crowbar lowered to the ground. Feeling nothing but pity for the bitter woman who confused love with hate, Camden looked away, meeting the sheriff's gaze. "This is my land, my tree, my fence. I want him arrested for destroying private property." "He's your grandson." "He's hellspawn." Before the sheriff could move to intervene, his grandmother swung the crowbar with all her might. Calm as he had never been calm before, Camden dropped the bolt cutters and raised his right hand to intercept the wicked hook descending on him, the strength of the mighty oak shoring him up. Wrenching the tool from her grip, Camden reversed the hook and yanked with all the power at his disposal on the chain-link fence, snapping the final link and tearing the overgrown fence from the trunk of the tree, sending bark flying. Grandmother screamed a piercing scream, tearing at her hair as she fell to her knees. As she did so, a surge of power swept through the meadow. Grasses plastered to the ground, and the new-minted leaves of the oak tree danced in the moonlight as Camden lifted his eyes to the oak's gnarled crown to recognize the essence of his mother lounging in the upper branches, finally as one with her own true tree.